It's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce our guest speaker today, Jorge Otero-Pailos, Director and Professor of Historic Preservation at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Jorge Otero-Pailos is an architect, artist, and theorist specializing in experimental forms of preservation. He is the founder and editor of the journal Future Interior, co-editor of Experimental Preservation, author of Architecture's Historical Turn, as well as a contributor to scholarly journals and books, including the Oxford Encyclopedia of Aesthetics and Rem Koolhaas's Preservation is Overtaking Us. Jorge Otero-Pailos is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences of Puerto Rico, and has received awards from major art, architecture, and preservation organizations, including the Crest Foundation, the Graham Foundation, the Fitch Foundation, the Canadian Center of Architecture, UNESCO, and the American Institute of Architects. He studied architecture at Cornell University and earned a doctorate of architecture at MIT. On a personal level, I've continually followed the work of Jorge Otero-Pailos over the past several years. What draws me to his investigations is his interest regarding the unwanted, the leftover, and the forgotten in an effort to consider an influential second life of these disturbances among the built environment. Please join me in welcoming Jorge Otero-Pailos.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you all for coming. I've enjoyed the day with students and reviews and so on. Everybody's in mid-reviews, and everybody was very stressful, so now you can relax and I get to stress, delivering the lecture. I want to talk to you about dust, and I want to talk to you about dust as an architectural material and what it takes to make space for the new within the existing built environment. Here is a work that I did early on in this process of working on the ethics of dust, where I took the book by John Ruskin and tried to write my own book by taking out some of the letters of the book with an X-Acto knife and then turning them into dust, essentially. And what was left of the letters in the book, when you read them, I was able to write a new narrative. So the book then, of course, here's the opening page. I'm not going to go through all of the pages, but it's now The Ethics of Dust, an installation by J.O.P., no student of fine art. Although I'm an artist and was always an artist, I never got to go to fine art school. I was taught by my parents, by my dad, by his friends. But not a formal student of fine art. Like maybe many of you here, you were going to go to art school and then somebody said, but hang on, you can add and subtract. Why don't you go to architecture school? And that's how I ended up in architecture school. Also, Frank Lloyd Wright had a little bit to do with it because when I went to visit his home and studio, I was blown away by what he could do with walls and windows and so here's a new story told with a book. I was very interested as a writer. How can I write without actually adding words to a page? How can I write without this idea that there's a blank slate? How can I write recognizing that the world is already written up and built up? So this was one of those experiments. And part of my work has to do with translating this idea into the built environment. So just as I was removing the words off of the page, I found myself removing the dust off of buildings, cleaning buildings. And so this is a cleaning test done on the Doge's Palace in Venice, right on St. Mark's Square. The whole thing has been cleaned multiple times, but right behind that arch over there is this wall, which no tourist can see from St. Mark's Square. And so that wall had never been cleaned. And so I had an opportunity for the Venice Biennial to remove the dust, the only leftover dust from the 19th century that was on the building. Now you can see how dirty this building was in the 19th century and how clean it is now. Why do we clean buildings? Part of it is to do with the fact that we think that cleaning is a way of caring for existing buildings. We associate it with our own body. We have to care for ourselves by cleaning ourselves. But of course, a lot of history of our environment is removed when we go from this picture on the left to that picture on the right. And as it turns out, now buildings like the Doge's Palace are cleaned every 30 years or so. They're maintained in a constant state of cleanliness. They weren't always that way, and at a certain point in history, we actually valued that dust differently. We associated it with time passing, with a stain of time, is the way that Ruskin described it. So what I did was to paint that whole wall with latex, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. And then as the latex dried, to pull the cast off of the wall, and you can see there all of the dust of that wall being transferred like a one-to-one photograph onto this cast. And this is the clean wall. Now you can see that it's still a different color than the limestone over here, because this limestone has been pressure washed. And pressure washing really removes the surface of the stone, so actually really damages the stone. This is a very, very light cleaning. So part of this was also to experiment in doing a lighter cleaning on the building, to taking care of it in a way that doesn't damage the stone. It was the first time that a building was cleaned with latex in Italy, so it was an experimental cleaning method. We had to prove that we could do it, therefore all those tests. And I later had the opportunity to do a cast in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And so here you can see a bit more of the process. So this is the raw latex that I apply to the buildings. It's applied in a kind of viscous form. It's water-based. So it goes on. It's a very laborious process. It's a painting process. We use a brush. And as it dries, this water evaporates. It can only evaporate in one direction because the wall doesn't absorb so much water. It evaporates away from the wall. And as it evaporates, it starts to dry out and pull the dust off of the wall. And then as the latex dries, it also becomes a skin. It polymerizes. And so it actually it embeds the dust on the surface. So then you can pull it off of the surface, and here we're pulling off that cast of the entire wall with all of the dust. Now here you have the actual cast of that inner wall. Now the wall is the wall inside of this column, and that's the largest object in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It is a cast of Trajan's column, which is a 1st century monument in Rome. That by the 19th century started to already erode. The surfaces were subject to acid rain, what we now call acid rain. And they realized that in around 1860s, and Napoleon III, who had led a campaign to take over Italy and was now in charge of Rome, commissioned a series of casts of Trajan's columns as a way to preserve them, because they figured it was going to be lost to acid rain. So pollution was already playing a part in the 19th century in the care of monuments, and the surface was at stake. And so here was one of those casts that was made, then being shown in this cast museum, which has casts from all of the major monuments of Europe. So if you were a working class person and couldn't travel, couldn't go on the grand tour of Europe, you could go to the Victoria and Albert Museum and you could take a virtual tour of the monuments of Europe. And for me, it was very important to put dust back in there, to show the dust in that space, because museums in the 19th century had their windows open. It's not what they are today. So the dust was coming in all of the time, and they had to clean all the paintings and sculptures. So inside, however, they had never really cleaned. And what was inside? When they had to figure out a backing for these plaster casts, they built a chimney. They built an industrial chimney. They're called the same people that were building industrial chimneys in Manchester and Leeds and Liverpool, and they came in, the same crews, and built a chimney there. There was no furnace underneath the chimney, but that's what they put these plaster casts on. So what you're seeing here is that chimney, the surface of that chimney with all that kind of dust in reverse that came into the chimney. And that chimney was receiving dust from 1872 when this went up till we cleaned it in the early 21st century. 2016 is when we cleaned it. Now, London is a very particular place in terms of dust because the UK was one of the first to industrialize. And so the environment in the UK had been polluted for a long time. People looked at Claude Monet's paintings of the Houses of Parliament and argued back and forth, oh, was he going blind? Was he getting cataracts? He wasn't seeing well. That's why he's painting all of this so hazy and yellow and so on. And nobody believed that really the pollution was like that in London until the forests of Canada burned, and then all of a sudden, a couple of years ago, we experienced in New York and other places in the United States orange skies. Those are the skies from very thick particulate matter. So all of a sudden we look back at this picture and say to ourselves, oh, okay, so he was painting a very polluted sky. And so what's interesting about this is when we look around our environment, it's very rare to see pollution. It's very rare to see it up in the sky today, and it's even rarer to see it on buildings, even though buildings are the most magnificent and fantastic environmental long-term sensors because they don't move and they receive all that dust. But what we do is remove it. And so the Houses of Parliament were very important for me, very important also because they are a kind of artistic measure of pollution, and people have been documenting them from across the Thames for a long time. This is 1952, the day of the Great Smog. This was the first time that there was a correlation between a pollution spike and deaths. This was the first time that they were able to say, oh, 3 days after this big pollution event, lots of people died in London hospitals. So it was very important for understanding that climate has a direct effect on people's health. What happened to this Big Ben, of course, is a 19th century building from the 1830s that came after the buildings around Westminster Hall burnt down. These were the royal courts and the tax offices of the British Crown. This building over here is the longest serving building built for purpose in the UK. It's been serving the British government for about 1,000 years. I mean, it's really remarkable. And it signifies a place where the associations of the Magna Carta, the kind of checks and balances on absolute power of the royalty were very important. So when all of this went up in flames, the whole of London came out to try to save this building. And they did. And so that door over here is to this building over here. And all of this that you see here is Pugin and Barry's neo-Gothic addition to that original Gothic building. Now, we were very fortunate to work with Art Angel, a public art commissioning body in the UK, to do an artwork inside of Parliament in which I had proposed to save all of the dust from Parliament. You know, there was this is a building that is constantly being preserved, but it had never been cleaned on the inside. And this was the beginning of a cleaning campaign. And you can see here, this is the cast that we did, and you can see people coming in to visit the building. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the inside of Westminster Hall. Here you see the stains of pollution. The doors were constantly open, so the smog from outside was coming in inside the building, and you can see kind of when near the door there's more, and then it fades out towards the back. It's almost like a football field inside. It's a very large building. It was the largest hammer beam oak roof of the medieval world in Europe. And you can see here it had been stained and looked that way for a very long time. Here's in 1952 with the lying in state of King George VI. All of the royals lie in state inside of Westminster Hall, partly to do with the fact that when Charles I, who was a king who was looking to Louis XIV and said, oh, we need to modernize the UK. How do we do that? Let's do like what the French are doing. They have an absolute monarchy. The absolute monarchy is the most efficient way to make decisions. You can make them fast. Everything is, is a benign monarch. So I want to be a benign absolute monarch. So he decided to dissolve Parliament and get rid of the whole democratic process. And so Parliament sent its militia to capture Charles I, tried him inside this building right here, right where he's sitting, lying in state, and sentenced Charles I to death. So it was the first regicide. And that is the beginning of what, a really strong message to absolute monarchs that they have to abide by the same rules as everybody else. And so they are not above the law. And that was very important then as a symbol, is that when the kings and queens die, they go to this place in a way to remember that story, that they're not above the law. Very important place for democracy, because now, of course, in America, our rulers are, we re-elect them every 4 years. So there's a kind of, absorption of this idea that the ruler must abide by all the rules, and that Parliament, Congress, and so on rules above the ruler. So the law prevails. And here you have the Queen Elizabeth II lying in state. Now, here's the difference. Look at that wall. It's all clean. Forget these little additions. This is actually plywood made to look like wood, made for all of the journalists that came in to photograph. But look at the wall, how clean it is, with relationship to that. That, I am very proud to say that we had a little bit to do with that. It took us 6 years to clean the whole interior of Westminster Hall. And here is what we were able to do afterwards, is to take all of that dust and to simply move it in front of the wall and to exhibit it again in relationship to the wall, but free from the wall, so it could tell its own story. And so the story is a collective story, because of course we make dust together. None of us is solely responsible for the environmental dust in the atmosphere, but we can't really have the world we have. We can't really have architecture without actually making some pollution. This building would be uninhabitable. We wouldn't be able to be here today unless we were burning some kind of fossil fuels to heat it up, right? So that pollution is as important and as part of architecture as the concrete and the wood that we have in here. It's an architectural material. The dust that comes through in buildings, I would argue, is an architectural material. And I wanted to show that material for itself and to be able to narrate the stories that I saw, the environmental stories that are encapsulated with it. So we prepared to tell our story. We prepared to do our grand opening on June 23rd, 2016. The crew was there. We rigged it up. We lit it up. And none of us thought that that day that we'd been given for the opening was the day of the Brexit vote, because everybody in London lived in a bubble and everybody thought that it was a non-issue. It was just political posturing and they were just going to do this thing, but it was going to be a Remain vote for sure. Of course, everybody woke up the next day and it was not Remain, it was Leave. So we were ready the next day to have our opening that night, and all of a sudden, we were so focused on our job that we weren't really worried about what's happening around the world. And we were so happy to see all of these journalists. They were like, oh my God, this is the most successful opening we've ever had. Look at all these journalists coming to see our work. And of course, they're all looking away from the work. They couldn't have cared less, right? They were there to try to accost the politicians who must go through that door to get into the House of Lords or the House of Commons, because this is the common chamber. So outside, a huge crowd gathered on Pall Mall. This is the road that leads from Trafalgar Square to Parliament. Along it, over here, is 10 Downing Street, the house of the Prime Minister. And as people walked, I was going from the place where I was staying down to the opening. And all of a sudden I found myself amidst this huge demonstration, walking down and stopping in front of 10 Downing Street. And they're screaming, "Shame on you," to the Prime Minister. And then they're gathering outside of Parliament Square, big crowd, lots of journalists coming down. And of course they can't get into Parliament because you can't get in. It's a secure area. Except that we had worked for years with Parliament to set up this whole system whereby if you went online and got a ticket to go see the public exhibition of art inside of Parliament, you could walk right in with your QR code. And so all of these people wised up and they started to sign up to see the art exhibit, and all started to go in, could care less about the art exhibit, but just to get in and try to, because once you're in, you could walk the halls of Parliament and find the politicians that you want to talk to. It was a really heady time because on Westminster Hall, of course, you have these plaques that are set up that mark the historical events that have happened inside this hallowed space from 1305 till the present. Different trials of Thomas More, the writer of Utopia, to famous speeches by Churchill and lying in states of kings and queens. And then, of course, the most recent setup over there was this memorial to Joe Cox, which was one of the PMs MPs that were there that was to memorialize her death. She had been killed outside of her home she was on the Remain camp, Remain in the European Union, and somebody from the Leave camp had gone up to her when she was leaving her house and stabbed her to death. And so there was this book of condolences. It was, just this really heavy atmosphere. So a lot of museums became interested in this piece, and we didn't know where to send it. We were kind of torn. How do we deal with this? We talked about it as a community and a lot of the people that were involved in the project, and then we decided, you know what, we're going to cut it, and we're going to give a piece to all of the museums of the different nations of the UK. Like, we were torn apart, well, let's just tear this thing apart and send it to the different museums. So a piece went to Northern Ireland, a piece went to Wales, to Scotland, to England, another to London. It was very difficult for me because if you think about it, right, let's say you have your projects, your designs, your beautiful artworks, and then somebody says, cut it in 7 pieces and send one to your aunt and to your, you'd say, my God, that's destroying my work, to tear it apart. You wouldn't do that with a typical painting. But actually, this was a real learning opportunity for me. I realized that the work became stronger in its breaking up and in its distribution. And it made me think that the buildings that are really, really important culturally, think of, for example, the Parthenon in Athens. They are torn apart and they're distributed. Pieces of the Parthenon are in London. They're in the Vatican museums. They're in Copenhagen. These really important buildings, we take them, we move them. They become distributed. And so I started working with this idea of, and here's a piece of it, this idea of distributed monuments. And so I started to think about the cast that I was taking as a form of taking a piece, that the dust was part of the monument, and I was taking a piece of that monument and distributing it around the world to other places so it could tell their story elsewhere. And so this is a piece that I did when I was a resident fellow at the American Academy in Rome, where actually, instead of doing one large piece, I cast different parts of the Academy and then brought them all together into one installation. And so I was very inspired by these Roman walls that have all these fragments of ancient Roman architecture embedded in them. So this was a little bit of a meta commentary on that tradition by having a cast of those walls with the pieces from the ancient world and have those next to other fragments from the Academy as well. This is, of course, the figure of Janus, the god that is looks forward and back at the same time, the kind of present and the past. It was the god of war because when Rome was at war, they would open the gates of the Janus temple, and when it was at peace, they would close it. So a very interesting a project here that I was able to try to raise the question, okay, you have all this dust from all around the world. What happens when you bring it back together? What kind of new stories can we write when we bring this dust back together? And writing history is a way of also bringing bits and pieces into the semblance of a whole. If you're a writer, if you're a historian, you know that you are, finding a fact here, finding a fact there, going to an archive there, and you're kind of bringing them together and then trying to create a narrative that tells the story. In fact, our lives are like that. When you think about your story, when does your story of your life begin? How do you tell your story? It's bits and pieces of your life. You don't tell the story of every day of what happened to you, right? Like from 9 a.m. till midnight every day. You choose different morsels. In fact, you can't remember all of your life. You can only remember little bits and pieces. And it's amazing how little we remember of our lives and how little it takes to tell that story, and then how invested we become in that story. So I became very interested in this idea of the fragments as pieces of narratives. And I began to think about how can I begin to take this and use it in my practice as a preservationist with other things. So I had been able to develop this whole body of work, The Ethics of Dust, to save dust. But I was presented with a very different problem here in the US Embassy in Oslo, where I was serving as preservation architect. And there was this incredible fence that was outside of the embassy that the Norwegian government, when they turned this into a monument, said, we don't want the fence, because it was not designed by Eero Saarinen, who was the original designer. And nobody bothered to ask who designed this fence. Well, a little bit of research, it didn't take much. It turns out it was designed by the office of Max Bond, who was the first African-American chairman of Columbia University's School of Architecture in the 1960s. So I said, that's not any fence. That's a really important fence. Can we save it? Of course, it had to go. So the question for me was, what is the meaning of this fence? How can I save it? Can I take it away? Can I take a piece and move it to another country and another place and help to enhance its story? Well, I started to do some research, and here you have the drawing done by Eero Saarinen, very famous architect. Have you guys heard, like a little students here, you heard of Eero Saarinen? Amazing, right? Yes. Incredible architect. He only practiced for about 10 years. That's what's amazing. Like, he died young, and he had so much work. He just wouldn't stop. And of course, what was amazing to me was that the way these buildings were designed, in the 1950s, the United States embarked in this incredible campaign to try to win the hearts and minds of the world through architecture. Wouldn't it be amazing if we did that again? You'd all have incredible jobs representing the American values abroad. And it built embassies that it had never built before. It built modernist embassies that were meant to demonstrate the principles of democracy to the world. And they did that by building essentially cultural centers. They had art galleries. They had nice theaters in which they would present Hollywood movies, and they would bring in speakers and give talks, and they would have libraries, and in those libraries you could go in and learn about how to conduct business with the United States. This was actually very important for me personally, because I came into the United States through my experience in one of those embassies. I walked into the library of the Spanish embassy, the US embassy to Spain in Madrid, and went to the library to figure out, how do you become a student in America? How do you go study in the United States? That was when I was about 12 years old, and I ended up coming here to do high school as a 13-year-old. So for me, it was very personal, this whole idea of, the representation of the values of democracy. Now, those were all well and good, but what was interesting was the outside of the building. Some people go in and they would get that experience, but what was the facade communicating? One of the important things to remember is we always use shorthand. We say the embassy building, but an embassy is the people. The building itself is called a chancery. And a chancery, the word chancery comes from the Latin cancellus, which means fence. So the meaning of the building is a fence. And it's so interesting that from the beginning, the Saarinen drawings always included a fence in front of the building. And in fact, when you look at the facade itself, it is a fence-like structure. And he made a lot of effort to always show it as if you could see right through the building. It was a porous facade. And inside the building, he designed this beautiful atrium and put a fence right in it. Instead of putting little balustrades, he put these teak fences all the way through. In other words, he used the fence as a symbol, and a symbol of democracy, but a symbol of diplomacy. Because as a diplomat, you have to remain open, but you also have to be guarded. You know, you can't just divulge all the secrets, right? You have to hold some stuff back. And that's part of the diplomatic process. It's different than a wall. A wall is closed off completely. So the fence was very important, and in 2002, the building, they had to, there were some security upgrades that had to be done because the US Embassy was right in the center of town. It was very vulnerable. You could drive a truck right up to it. So they put this fence around it. And when the United States sold the embassy, because it needed a larger embassy, and sold it to a private client, then it became a monument. It became a protected monument of Norway. They couldn't do it before because before the embassy technically was sitting on US land. So the Norwegian laws did not apply to the embassy. In fact, if there was a fire inside the embassy, the firemen couldn't go in unless the ambassador allowed them to go in. So it all happened very quickly when the United States sold the building. A new developer buys it, and then the preservation process begins. And there was a triage process. What do we keep? What do we throw? And I realized that this was not unique to Oslo. It was happening all over the world to all these embassies that were designed by some of the most amazing mid-century architects, including Breuer, Gropius, Sert, Harrison, Abramovitz, all these incredible 20th century, mid-century architects. Here you can see some of the ones that have been sold or decommissioned or already threatened. So my project, I became very concerned with how do we save these embassies? How do we preserve them? They're super hard to preserve. You can't do it through the normal legal processes. They're far away. People haven't been to them. Americans haven't necessarily traveled to these embassies, so they can't care for something they haven't seen. So the traditional preservation work of policy making, of abiding by the rules and regulations didn't work. Here we had to lead through a different process, an experimental preservation process. And art could lead the way in preservation. So how could we do that? So I started to focus on this fence to say, okay, the fence was on the inside. That's going to stay. We're going to be able to preserve that in situ. But this outside fence is an opportunity to really take the message of the fence elsewhere. And so, okay, we had to demolish it. So I asked the new developer, would you let me do the demolishing? Let me work with the demolition crew and use the demolition machines as my tool brush. And so I started working with the contractors and said, okay, twist this way, twist that way, so that I could start to get the steel, which is solid military grade steel, into a kind of sculptural form that I could begin to envision sculptures out of. I took all of these pieces to a big site. We rented this very large welding shop outside of Oslo, and then I laid all the pieces out into a field, walked around them, and was selecting this piece, that piece, and then either cut little pieces of it or assembled them together into larger sculptures, welding them together. I was able to make 51 of these. I started very big. You can see some of these early ones were very big. Then I started running out of energy. I started running out of time. I started running out of money. And so the last piece, the last one is about this big. So, but it was a super fun. I spent a whole summer doing this outside of Norway, outside of Oslo. And so these pieces now take on a different life. They are mobile. They are no longer part of the, they're not stuck to the ground next to the embassy, but they tell the story of the embassy. The history of the embassy is part of what they are. And so I ended up with, as I said, 51 of these. And here you can see a few of them with different names that I'm going to talk about in a second, how I got to those names. The question was then, all right, so they come from Oslo, but what happens when I bring them now as sculptures that are mobile to other places like New York? Where in New York? I was very fortunate to have a commission from the Fund for Park Avenue to exhibit the sculptures on New York's Park Avenue. And I did a lot of research on Park Avenue to think, okay, where should these sculptures go? I don't just want to pepper them all over Park Avenue. I want to think very carefully about the site. So I placed one right here between the Lever House and the Seagram building by Mies van der Rohe over here. And this was a very important building because the US Embassy in Norway was influenced by this building. It's on 53rd Street. It's a black building. Saarinen was looking at it when he was designing the US Embassy, and then Saarinen got to build a skyscraper right next to it on 53rd Street as well. 53rd is where MoMA is as well, by the way, very important connection. And lo and behold, Saarinen designed a black skyscraper, CBS, it's called Black Rock, right in front of, right along 53rd. But the more important thing for me was, could this sculpture, once you place it in a site, serve as a way, as a window to open up the history of this site? And I did a lot of research onto the history of the site, and as it turns out, the whole idea of putting sculptures on Park Avenue began when the Seagram building created the plaza. And the Seagram, Phyllis Lambert in particular, started a public sculpture program. The first sculpture that was placed on Park Avenue was not a piece of contemporary architecture, it was a piece of heritage. It was an Olmec sculpture from Mexico. And it was placed there in 1965 as a kind of counter monument, as a token of appreciation for the building of the US Embassy, the new building of the US Embassy in Mexico. So there was this connection between embassies and heritage. The next sculpture that was placed on the Seagram building was another piece of heritage, this time from Chile, from Rapa Nui, from Easter Island, a head from Easter Island. And it was placed there by the International Fund for Monuments, which was just beginning at the time, as a way to say, we're here, we are a new preservation organization. Eventually they were called the World Monuments Fund. And they hired or worked together with Thor Heyerdahl, who was a Norwegian explorer, experimental archaeologist. If you've ever heard the word Kon-Tiki, anybody heard the word Kon-Tiki? Kon-Tiki, he's a guy that recreated an Inca ship and floated it from Peru all the way to Polynesia in the 1950s to prove his theory that Polynesia was peopled by Incas, not from Australia. Nobody believed him until he floated himself over there. So he was like quite a big-time personality. And he said, this is proof. These heads, you can find them in Polynesia as well. More importantly, they were trying to raise awareness about the threats to heritage worldwide by bringing them to New York. And that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to bring these sculptures to New York to raise awareness about the threats to US embassies abroad and the need to try to preserve them. Others went in front of the Park Avenue Armory, which is a military building that was turned into a cultural institution. And part of the idea here is, wouldn't it be nice, for example, to turn some of these embassies back into cultural institutions? One of the ones that comes to mind is the U.S. Embassy in Dublin, designed by John Johansson, which is going to be decommissioned soon. What about a Irish-American cultural center there? That would be amazing. Now, one of the things that these sculptures did as well was to make a site where they are analogous to another site. So now the New York site became analogous to the site in Norway. This notion of analogous sites became very generative for me. In fact, I called the exhibition Analogous Sites, because I was trying to figure out, what is the meaning of these sculptures? Well, the meaning are all the stories that have been told through the fence itself. And so I started looking at all of the treaties that the United States has signed and agreed upon with Norway. And some of them had to do with this idea of creating analogous sites. So analog sites, really within the context of those treaties, refer to the attempt to use Earth as a site analogous to Mars. So we try to actually do on Earth what we plan to do on Mars. And so there are a few of these sites. One of them is in Norway. This is the Svalbard site. This one is in Greenland. And this one over here is in Spain, in New Carthage. I went to New Carthage, and I looked at the site, and it looks like the surface of the moon. It is completely barren. There's nothing there. And I asked myself, why is it barren like this? Well, it turns out that this is where the ancient Romans mined for silver. The Roman Empire, as it grew, the only way it had to keep people in the empire was because the Roman currency was the world currency. So everybody bought dinars from the Romans. So they needed to produce money to bring people into the empire. But they ran out of silver, so they couldn't make any more silver. So they had to conquer the silver mines in Spain, what's now Spain, New Carthage at the time. And they had fracking technology. So they brought pressurized water and they turned mountains inside out to get to the silver ore. And the mountains still look like that. So I did these castings of these mines in Spain. These were actually exhibited in Australia, which is one of the largest exporters of coal to China. Doing research at that site, I found out that the dust from this site in Spain, this analogous site, which we now use to explore the future of Mars, can be found in the other analogous site, the one in Greenland, where we are also planning the exploration of Mars. And that just blew my mind. I said, how could there be dust from this place in Greenland? Well, it turns out that the Romans had to burn so much wood to make the silver that the dust they created went up into the sky, and if you follow the trade winds, went down to South America, up through North America, and then over again to Greenland and deposited in Greenland. So the ancient Romans had already polluted with dust the whole of the earth. And that really put things into perspective for me, because I thought that we had started that that's what made us modern. In the 19th century, we polluted the earth. But no, the Romans already polluted the earth. And the dust that they made is still there. So for me, that really put dust into a whole new category of cultural heritage. Because if we think of heritage as the things that last and connect us across time, the material, physical reality that lasts, that dust is there. It's been there for 2,000 years. It's as important as the Colosseum in Rome or all of the Roman monuments. In fact, this building won't be here in 2,000 years. But the dust that this building made will be here 2,000 years from now. And the Romans, at the peak of their empire, were only 70 million people. And we're pushing 8 billion people. So the amount of dust we're making will certainly be a layer on the Earth's crust that will be there. So how do we care for that? How do we relate to that culturally? That's where the notion of analogous sites for me became very important. That dust moves, can we think of preservation as something that, a preservation of architecture in relationship to movement? And so I started to really think about this as a process, you know, working with all of these different sites to think, what if we then now bring this to New York? Well, what is the meaning of this? How do I give people access to all of this? Well, I thought to myself, okay, let me look at those treaties that the United States signed and literally take the words from the treaties and give those as titles to my sculptures. But then to actually take the sculptures and have them intervene in the treaties so that now the treaties become themselves artworks and the writing on the treaty becomes involuted and transformed into the sculptures. In a way, enacting the discussions that the diplomats must have had, which, you know, when you negotiate with someone, you are actually talking and you don't know where this is going to go, right? You don't know where the discussion is going to go. It's circuitous. It moves around in all directions. In the end, it becomes a text that looks very, very rational and, right? It's like your thesis, right? When you finish your thesis, all you guys that are doing your thesis, it'll look like you knew what you're doing from the beginning, but you know that you went around in circles. And so I wanted to bring around the expression of that conversation and the fact that these lines are never straight. They kind of come in and around onto each other. And also, as architects, we draw and we write. If you look at the drawings of an architect, they have a lot of text in them. They're not just lines on the page. And those texts are meaningful. So I wanted to also push the idea of architectural drawing here a bit. And so I made these prints. Each of these prints corresponds to one of the sculptures. And so you can see the sculpture in the print. And then each of these prints has a title, which is the title of the sculpture. So really, the project is really the sculpture and the drawing. Just like architecture is never just the building, it's the building, the drawings, the photographs that are taken, what's said about the building, all of that is architecture. So then, of course, I thought about, okay, well, how does this all become kind of a project, a drawing set? And I began to think about this as an artist book. Now, we think of, you know, the drawings of a building or a drawing set, but I started to think about the drawings of this fence as a drawing set. And I thought, okay, how do I fit them into an artist book? Well, I began to think about folding them. And of course, you can imagine, I'm thinking, how many times am I going to fold it? How am I going to fold it? Is it going to be folded this way or that way? And I settled on folding it twice because a bifold in Greek is a deep blow. 2 folds in Greek. So, of course, that's the root of diploma. You're all going to get a diploma when you get out of here. That's a folded piece of paper. Diplomats get a folded piece of paper as their letters of credentials that they have to present to the other government, and that's all they get. It's the art of diplomacy, what you do with that diploma. So the art of architecture for you is going to be, what do you do with your diploma once you get out of here? And that, for me, was very important, that the work be true to the concept of diplomacy that it really began from. So once you fold a piece of paper twice, you get a triangle. And the plan of the US Embassy in Norway is also a triangle. So if you see it here, I etched the plan of the US Embassy in Norway right onto the book as a mirror. And I changed all the room names, the 51 different titles of the sculptures. So the plan of the embassy becomes a table of contents for all of the 51 prints inside the artist's book. And then once you fold it, you can insert that print inside of that of the plinth and have a little paper model of the US Embassy in Norway. And of course, now the text and the fence come back to the perimeter of the building and reestablish the location of the origin. They trace you back. They take you back to, this is where all of these texts came from. This is where the embassy came from. And if you look inside, then you're reflected. So you are part of, you see your face inside of the plan, and that's where you see yourself. So it all gets closed into a book, this diplomatic valise that you can take anywhere to tell the story of the embassies and to advocate for their preservation and the story of these defenses. We were fortunate that this was exhibited at the U.S. State Department. I think this museum has subsequently closed, but it was exhibited there, or it's in transition, I'm not sure where, but it is the Museum of the United States State Department. So it was shown there, and it was wonderful because this was exhibited at the same time that it was the 50th anniversary of the NATO treaty, and some of the people that came to celebrate that. The NATO treaty was exhibited just across the hall from this room where we had that, and some of the people came in and they looked at the treaties and they said, "Oh my God, that's my signature. I signed that treaty," because all the signatures are part of the treaty. So that was a nice moment to really make this a connection, not only to the world of architecture, but also to the world of diplomacy. And as architects engaged in the world, and as preservationists engaged in the built environment and its histories, we sometimes, always have to get outside of our disciplinary boundaries and engage with other disciplines. But we have to meet them where they are. And diplomats like text. That's what they write. They don't read plans. So these treaties meet the diplomats where they are and bring them into our conversation. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. Much appreciated.
Well, I was going to ask anybody if they had any questions. I can come around and try to grab a couple questions if we have some time.
If there are some questions, yeah.
Anybody have questions?
Have a little drink.
Oh, we got one here. There we go.
Okay. Yeah.
So how did you come up with like the mirror and the final like box being the perimeter fence around like the triangle plan of the embassy?
Through a lot of iterations, it's like any creative process. So one of the things that we tried to do in the studio is to give ourselves a lot of leeway, to just try things out and to say, okay, that doesn't work, let's try something else. But to think of, to play pretend, I think that's a very important thing. What if, have anybody here done comedy, like stand-up? In stand-up, like the basic, if you like SNL, you watched SNL or gone to Second City in Chicago, right? The principle of stand-up is you go with it. Okay, the floor's on fire. What do we do? Oh yeah, the floor's on fire and there's a bridge over here. Right? So you start playing with it, and then things come up in that dialogue, in that playfulness. But if you start by saying, "What are you talking about? The floor's not on fire," that's over. In the design process, you got to believe the floor's on fire. So what if we make this into an artist book? What if we fold it this way or that way? What if the text becomes a fence? Well, that's a stupid idea. Well, no, you don't want to say it's a stupid idea. All ideas are stupid until you make them happen, right? So you just try it. And so there's no mystery to it. It's just hard work, iteration, and allowing yourself to play. And then eventually you're like, wow, that's kind of interesting. Let's go with that. Yes?
Who'd you buy the plaster from?
Sorry, what?
Who'd you buy the plaster from?
The plaster?
Yeah, you use the latex.
Oh, the latex. The latex is made in Belgium. It's called Arte Mundit. I see that you're going to try it. But you can get any latex to do this. The latex is called Arte Mundit. It was a Belgian company. It's now been acquired by a German company. It is designed specifically to clean buildings. So, you know, if you, I don't think they have a distributor in the US these days, but if you want some technical information on that and you want to try it, you want to give it, so if you want to, this is something that, I mean, I encourage everyone to give it a shot. You have to go online and order it. But there are some versions here in the United States of it, like Prosoco company, it's a chemical company, they do a version of that. The benefit of Artemundit is it doesn't have, so latex comes from the latex tree. It has a whole very problematic history, latex, which we can talk about, of exploitation in the Congo and the Amazon. I mean, had I known that history when I started this project, I don't know if I would have used latex. I'm kind of happy that I didn't know, but it is a history that is important in terms of the material histories. And now it's a different story, but where it began, it was a extractivist colonialist enterprise that was brutal. But it's the sap of a tree, and it goes bad very quickly because it decays like a fruit, you know, it rots. So what they did is that they put ammonia in it to stabilize it. And that smells really bad. So over time, and I've been very close to the founder of Artemundit over the years, collaborating with them to develop different techniques and applications to different, each of these projects is a way to test. For example, the one that I showed you in the museum, it was very important that it didn't smell like ammonia, because people would freak out if they walk into a museum room. Oh my God, what is the smell, right? So they have a different stabilizer that they put in to make sure it doesn't rot. So every company, why am I telling you this? Every company, every different manufacturer has their secret mix, and they don't want to talk about what's in the mix. So, just check what it smells like, and always wear a mask. Yeah.
Is there a specific type of material that you look for when you're doing these castings? I notice a lot of them are porous materials, but have you ever done anything on metal, and do you get the same sort of results or anything like that?
Yeah, as you can imagine, I've put latex on just about everything. It doesn't work as well in metal. It works really well in porous materials and masonry, concrete, brick. That's what it's. Because all those materials, concrete, you can even see from here, they have little holes in them. And that's where the dust kind of settles in. What's really great about the latex is it goes in there, and then as it hardens, it'll pull out that stuff from inside. If it's too deep, the latex will stay in there. It'll break. It won't be able to dry. So you have to really assess the wall and make sure. But yeah, it's really best. You get the most beautiful cast from, and it really works to clean better masonry. But you could put it on metal, except that it's just not, if it's rusty, it's going to pull some of the rust off. Sometimes it's very interesting. Latex is a very interesting material because it will respond and change completely its chemical structure depending on what metal it touches and what chemical it touches. So the rubber in your tires is the vulcanization of rubber through the addition of sulfur and boiling and so on, and it becomes black and hardens. So it's really amazing. You could experiment with throwing different things in it, but it's a whole material history there that it's yet to be written. Some people have written histories of latex, but I think more can be done. Okay.
Well, again, thank you for showing your stuff, and
Thank you.
thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.